Today I'm going to show you how to restore this hideous tabletop into something like this. This was actually one of the first tables I ever built. After I had initially built it, I wasn't really satisfied with it, so I took it to the garage to make some adjustments, and it kind of just stayed there for like a year. I didn't have any space to work out of in the garage, so this coffee table became my workspace. And since I finally have a designated area to work out of, I figured this coffee table could use some love. I highly recommend starting with an orbital sander. You can of course sand by hand, but it'll really take a long time because you have to go through a few grits. I started with 80 grit sandpaper, jumped up to 150, and then ended at 240. And if your table's as messy as mine, you're probably going to want to vacuum it before you start. I mentioned that we would be starting with the 80 grit sandpaper. The lower the grit, the more rough the sandpaper is. When you're using the 80 grit sandpaper, your main goal is going to be to try to remove a majority of the stain and anything else that's on the surface. Depending on the condition of your tabletop, you might have an easier time than what I'm having. The stain can be a little stubborn sometimes, so what you see me doing is angling my orbital sander to put most of the focus on that area. Like I mentioned, this table was a work surface, so it had anything from screw holes to circular saw cuts, and honestly I don't even know what that is. I used to care more about the condition of the wood, but after I saw a video where someone was smacking the tabletop with a hammer to make it look more rustic, that threw the ideology out the window for me. After all the sanding, the wood still had some dark spots, but right here I'm just demonstrating that those can actually help add texture. Another thing to note was that the end grain was very dark because of the old stain. This can honestly be sanded down, but I was tired of sanding, so I decided to cut it off instead. I grabbed my speed square to make sure the cut was at 90 degrees, then I clamped down a straight piece of wood and used that as a guide. You'll also notice we got some sharp edges in the process, so I cleaned up the work area and rounded them over with my orbital sander. This is just to preserve some shins and possibly kneecaps depending on your height. Once the bulk of the work was done, I started sanding with 150 grit sandpaper. And after I was done with that, I used the 240 grit sandpaper. The lower portion was sanded with 240 grit sandpaper, and this upper portion was sanded with 150 grit sandpaper. You can see a difference in smoothness. With that said, I made sure to sand the rest of the tabletop with 240 grit sandpaper. Aside from making the tabletop more smooth, sanding to this grit will also allow the stain to soak in perfectly. Preparing for stain is really about balance. If your grit is too low, the wood might soak in too much stain. On the other hand, if the grit is too high, the wood becomes too smooth to soak in the stain. That's not to say that the wood won't stain if you use different grits, it might just mean that you won't get the result you're looking for. I know I made the wooden tabletop the focal point of this video, but I also wanted to cover how I restored the base as well. Admittedly, the base wasn't as beat up as the tabletop, but it was still in pretty bad condition. A majority of the base already had spray-on primer on it, but I wanted to sand everything down again just to make it very smooth. If you're restoring furniture with paint on it, you can honestly follow the same steps that we followed for the tabletop. This means just sanding down to something like 80 grit sandpaper, jumping up to 150, and then using 240 for the final product. Once I felt that everything was nice and smooth, I used Rust-Oleum spray-on primer just so the paint would bond to the wood nicely. Now that the entire base was primed, I brought out Rust-Oleum's white paint. Since the primer is also white, it was a little difficult to tell which areas were and which areas weren't painted. That said, I just made sure to give the entire base various layers of white paint, just to be sure. While I waited for that to dry, I got the tabletop ready for a clear coat. To fit the barn style theme that this table seems to be following, I used Varathane's oil-based polyurethane, and this is in the clear semi-gloss finish. I know it's a little early on, but you can tell right away how quickly the wood comes to life with this. And now, while that dries, we're going to give the base a clear coat, just for added protection. This applies to pretty much any clear coat, primer, or spray paint that comes out of a can, but remember to stay about 6 inches away and move in light passes. Once that was dry, I added the tabletop to the base and then secured it from the bottom using screws. Last but not least, I vacuumed it a little bit just to make it a little bit more presentable. After that, our restoration was complete. If you've made it this far, I really want to thank you for watching. If you'd like to keep seeing content like this, please feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you.